So today we're thinking about Ruth. It's the first in a series about Ruth. It's something we're looking at from the perspective of an overview of the book of Ruth today, thinking about the background and thinking about how we pay close attention to the text, both from a story point of view and from a rounded thinking point of view. Quite a lot of you might know something about Ruth, and you might have an idea of what you think Ruth is about already, and you might be really happy to think that you know everything about Ruth. Some of you might have passed Ruth by and not heard about it since Sunday school, or never really given it a good look, and everything in between. So today we're going to focus on a sort of an all-round view of Ruth, really, and reading it like a story, and reading and seeing what we can spot about the characters within it. You'll have noticed that over the next 2 or 3 sessions we've got together, we are looking at some very particular themes around Ruth. One about a feminist reading of Ruth, one about money, sex and power, particularly with an angle for helping young people find their way through Ruth, and one about immigration and migration and politics. And so, although we'll undoubtedly touch on those today, we're probably not going to give them the deep dive that you might want, because that's going to be coming up over the next few weeks. I think that's everything from me in terms of an initial introduction. So I'm going to introduce Michael to talk to us a little bit more of an introduction around Ruth, and he's probably going to be pressing the go button if he hasn't already, as far as recording is concerned. So Michael, over to you for a moment.
Nice one. Thanks, Jane. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bible Month. This feels like it's been a long time coming, because I've been thinking about this sort of since I started my job in November. And then March didn't happen, and then May didn't happen, and now it's June and it's happening, and that's nice. Great to be with you. I thought it would be a really important thing for us to begin the whole month of 30 days in Ruth by actually reading the story. And one of the things I'm really passionate about when we come to the Bible is it's really important that we know that when we read it, it's okay that we read it through our own eyes and our own lens. Like, we've all been made by God. We've all been equipped by God to be able to engage well with the text. And so it's totally fine that we read it through our own lens, but it's also tricky sometimes, because our lens is not necessarily the lens that the writer had. And one of the tasks of exegesis sometimes is trying to understand what the function of a text was, as well as how we receive the text today. So texts were produced in the life of the history of Israel, or the life of the history of the church, for a particular reason. They found their way into the scriptures for a particular reason. And sometimes it's helpful for us to explore that reason, as well as how we read it and what we get out of it today. And often we may realize that our reading of the text and the original intention behind the text may be in conflict with one another, but that's okay, because actually part of reading scriptures alongside one another is learning to hold those tensions of those different readings. So what we're going to do today is we're going to read the text together, and I've actually got a version which I sent round to you in the email, which is designed as a play. This has not been done by me. This has been done by a chap called John Goldingay, who, if you're not familiar with him, he is a world-renowned Old Testament scholar. He's a significant individual in the world of scholarship, and particularly Old Testament studies. And when he teaches Ruth, he will begin his lectures in this way. So it may not read exactly like it does entirely in your Bible, whichever translation you're using. But he has translated it from the Hebrew and has done a good kind of scholarly job of it. So I have every faith in the version that we're going to be engaging with, even if it's not strictly the NIV or the NRSV, because, you know, we're good Methodists, aren't we? So we all read the NRSV. So that's where we got it from. For those of you who are accessing this webinar on YouTube, I'll place a link in the description below to John's website, where you can download the PDF for free, so that you can follow the script at home as well. The reason why I think it's really helpful for us to approach it as a play and as a script is because partly as we read it together, and what we're going to do is have different people taking different parts. When we hear a text, it's very different from when we read it. When we're not in control of the tone that someone uses, the inflections, the pauses, the pacing, we are exposed to the text in a way that is different to the way that we would automatically read it, which means that sometimes we notice things we haven't noticed, or we hear a version that we haven't quite heard before. Even if you just imagine one person reading a part with anger or one person reading it with compassion, you're confronted with two very different interpretations of the text. And what I like about reading things like this together is that it exposes us to something we wouldn't normally see. So that's one reason we're doing it. Another reason why I like the idea of approaching this as a play is because it reminds us that we receive this book as a story. This has been presented to us as a narrative. And by approaching it as a play, I think we're more sensitive to the fact that there are different characters. There's a cast of characters, and each character has their own motives, their own experiences of events, their own emotions attached to it. And sometimes if we're just reading it flat, we place our own expectations on those events and experiences and emotions on those characters. Whereas again, when we hear other people reading it to us, we may be offered a different interpretation. But it helps us engage with this as a story, as opposed to just a flat text. One of the other things I think is important about that is the writer, or as it's kind of coined in the script version, the narrator is trying to evoke something from us. Like any playwright or any story writer, they're wanting us to respond and resonate with, or be horrified by, or be engaged by, or be curious about the events. And again, sometimes I think when we come to scripture, we read it flatly. And I think often Old Testament narratives, we are invited to have a response to. And I'd argue actually that the Holy Spirit will sometimes bring up that response in us. And I think it's approaching as a play changes our posture to the story. So I don't know if you've ever had the experience of reading something like Judges and being utterly horrified by some of what's in there. I remember reading the story of Samson as a kid and kind of thinking Samson was a bit like Hercules and really cool, and then returning to the story of Samson as an adult and being utterly horrified by how deplorable this individual is. No longer a kind of like a children's hero who can wrestle with lions. He's suddenly just an amoral person. But we are invited to be horrified by that. It's okay, actually, that in reading the story, we have an emotional response to it. And I think when we approach things at that level, we are posturing ourselves better to the text. So that's another reason why I like it as a play. And thirdly, you'll see as we go through this that there is a character in the script called the Professor, which is basically the voice of John, interjecting little moments of normally explaining the meanings of characters' names. And I'm really grateful, because what that little professor's voice does is it invites us to see some of the genius of the text. Like the fact that characters' names resonate with their experiences and their stories, it invites us into appreciating some of those quirks and remembering that the writers of scripture are very, very clever. And there's so few details or no details, I'd argue, that are wasted. So some things that may seem inconsequential to us, like a character called Naomi, is actually a very carefully crafted decision. In the same way that we might appreciate that elements of Shakespeare you may miss on the surface reading, when someone opens it up and explains what's going on, you go, oh, that's so much more clever than I ever appreciated it was. So I think approaching it using this script helps us be aware of those things too. So are you up for reading? Little nod, little wave, little thumbs up. Great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to split us into rooms where there's going to be about 8 or 9 people in those rooms. And I want you to very quickly divide up the parts between you of who's going to read what. And then I'm going to give you 20 minutes to read through the text. I think it takes actually about 11 minutes. So you'll have more than enough time to read through it. And then if you get to the end before the breakout rooms come back, I just invite you to ask yourselves the question, how has how has approaching this as a play affected the way that I've engaged with it? Has it changed the way that I've reacted in any way? Have I seen something I haven't seen before? What has it brought up in me, if anything? So I'm going to open up those breakout rooms now, if that's okay. And enjoy your reading. I'll see you in about 20 minutes.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. You're all zooming back to us now, quite literally and metaphorically, one way or another. So it's good to see you. I think we're up to our maximum number of participants, and we can see everybody in the space. I wonder if you might just give me a physical wave if you've been in a Zoom breakout room before. Okay, I'm just keeping my eyes peeled for anybody who's not. Michael and I, thank you very much. Michael and I were wondering what it would be like to be in a Zoom breakout room for the first time and as part of your experience. So you maybe let us know. So I'm going to invite you to put us all back on speaker view if you've not already done that. And I'm going to hand it over to Michael again to tell us a little bit about what's going to happen next.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. I hope you managed to get through the whole script together before we pulled you back. I just wonder if we could have a quick, this is where we're going to use the chat function. I just wondered if it would be helpful for you to drop a note into the chat, just a single sentence. How did you find that? What was your reflection or what was your experience? Just the one sentence one, and we'll go round. There's no right or wrong answer. It's helpful from our point of view to gauge that, but also we want to make sure that people have an opportunity to actually be heard. So if you want to drop that in the chat, and then I may just go through and read some of people's experiences out for the rest of the room.
How do you do that?
So if you go to the bottom and select chat, which should appear underneath the video.
No.
It's a little chat icon.
It's at the top on my iPad.
Oh,
top
okay.
Right. Top right.
Might be different on iPads.
Yeah, I've got an iPad.
There's more. It says more.
Oh, right, more. Right, chat. Oh, I see. Thank
there
you.
we go. That's really helpful. Thanks, Janet.
And of course, if you're not putting anything in, but you've got the chat function open, you can also read what everybody else is typing at the moment, as well as Michael go through some of it, which is interesting.
Okay, just as you type, I'm going to read out some of your reflections. So we've got interesting, helpful, useful. Someone enjoyed the info from the professor. That's good. You can feel free to argue with the professor if you want. You'd be going up against John, not me. So brought alive. I like that. I will take that. Hard going on the opposite end of the spectrum. Thanks for sharing that. Surprised. Gave the story movement and interaction. Good. Could have done with 5 minutes longer. Apologies if you felt rushed. Professor's input added some sense of meaning. Our one group didn't finish. Apologies. Stilted as an interesting reflection as well. So some good experience, some negative experience. I guess what I want to suggest again is one of the reasons why I think this is really helpful is it causes us, approaching it as a script causes us to ask questions of the characters, not ask questions of ourselves. So Jane and I have been having an ongoing battle around the preparation of Bible Month because her particular approach to this, she'd probably read it more through a feminist lens and is quite angry, I guess, at some of the way that Ruth seems to be treated. And we have opportunity to probe some of that with Jane next week. I'll be hosting her reflections then. And part of my pushback is I think that whilst that is a legitimate accusation to bring to the text from our sociological positioning and our kind of like more pro-women culture. At the same time, I don't think that necessarily the narrator is trying to present Ruth's experience as negative. So what I want to do is spend a couple of minutes with you just reflecting, what do you think the experience of the characters are? Not, you know, what is your interpretation of the events, but what do you think their experiences are, their motives are, their emotions are at various points in the story? So maybe we could have a couple of people, if you want to provide a comment on that, maybe you could raise your hand. If you haven't used Zoom before, you can do that either digitally or on video. And Jane is going to go through and call out different people and I'll invite them to share their thoughts. But beginning with Naomi, what do you think Naomi's experiences or the emotion that she's feeling is, or her motives are at various points in the story? Jane, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Susan on the iPad, she's got her hand up. We'll hear from Susan first and then we'll go to Fiona second. Susan, you might have to unmute yourself for me.
That's useful, isn't it?
Thank you.
Yes, I think Naomi was quite depressed and low. She felt that sort of Yahweh was against her, really. She lost everything, lost her husband and then losing her 2 sons. And then I think she was shocked and surprised and delighted that her daughter-in-laws wanted to stay with her, but she wanted them to have a life, you know, a chance of a new life and a new husband somewhere. So when one went off, that was fine. But Ruth had obviously become very fond of her mother-in-law and was determined to stay with her, which was a very precious gift. And it transformed her life altogether. So she went through a lot of different emotions going up and down throughout the story.
Okay, thanks, Susan. That's lovely. Fiona.
That's it. Right. I think I've done it. Oh dear. I think you said he's absolutely lovely, and I feel really awful that I can't see it that way in a way, because when they are going to clear off their original homes, I'm hearing someone who's just like, well, there's no point me having you with me. You were meant to give my sons children, and you failed. Off you go back home. That is how it feels to me. You're going to slow me down. You're going to be a problem for me. You're 2 extra mouths to feed. And then when she says, off you go and slip into his bed, sweetie, I feel conflicted about that. It's like, well, how do I make my life nicer? I know I'll make sure I can manipulate Ruth and Boaz. I don't know. I feel very, very about Naomi. That doesn't help, does it? Sorry, can I apologise to everyone?
No, thank you very much. Thank you. Anybody else waving their hand at me about Naomi? Kim, if you wouldn't mind.
I think both of them, you could express both opinions. Is that actually what we don't name is that Naomi starts the story really suffering grief. This is the 4 stages, the anger, and she's got to process this all the way through, and then comes the birth of a grandson that probably doesn't take away the grief that she's lost her own sons, but gives her that glimmer of hope that the family line and the family name will continue. But she starts off incredibly, angry and bitter and frightened and worried. We would maybe name that as grief, and maybe depression might move into that as well.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Anybody else waving their hand at me about Naomi? We'll maybe just take this one last thought. Oh, Kate, thank you. Kate Ellis.
The way I see Naomi was that she would know the situation that Ruth was potentially going to with her. She would know to herself that it would be hard, and yet she still told Ruth to stay put or to go back to her own mother. I see that as a very selfless act, not one that, and also bearing in mind, as Kim just said, she would have been grieving, and she would want support, and yet she was willing not to have it. I thought that was very honourable of her, so I see her in a very different light to Fiona.
Okay. We've got a couple of electronic hands waving at us. Cesar and Helen, and we'll take those two and then we'll hand back to Michael. So Cesar first.
Okay, yes, I agree entirely with with Kate, and disagreed with Fiona. I think Naomi was quite generous because she knew that her daughters-in-law would be foreigners in her if they came with her, and how difficult it will be, and so on. And that she thought perhaps that it would be better if they went back home with her, with their relatives, rather than come with her.
Okay, thank you. And Helen?
Yeah, I was thinking that, you know, perhaps Orpah wasn't very sincere when she said, we'll stay with you. It's almost like she was saying it because she felt it was the right thing to say, but as soon as Naomi gave her the let-up clause, she was off.
Okay, lovely. Michael, there we have it in a bubble already. Let's hand back to you to see what we need to do next.
I mean, this is exactly why I love the Bible, and particularly Old Testament narrative, is because it invites different perspectives and it encourages us to bring our own thoughts. And it's amazing how we can cast characters differently. And it's worth saying that in doing this, we're not being unfaithful to the text. We are continuing a long tradition of engaging with the Jewish scriptures this way. So be encouraged that these differences of opinion are good and healthy, and hopefully increase our love of the perplexing nature of the text rather than propel us away from it. Let's discuss Boaz quickly, shall we? Because there are very different ways that you can cast his motivations and his emotions and his experiences. So I'd love some thoughts on that quickly. Over to Jane to select participants again.
To try my hardest. Anybody waving at me around Boaz? I'm looking very hard, but I'm not spotting anybody's hands. Thank you. Pat, I don't know if you're Pat GU or who you are, but I
just wonder whether Boaz was already married, or was he single? Had he not got any children of his own? Did he see her as a daughter? Did he see her as a partner? I don't think that comes out at all in the text. So I like to think of him sort of as a very caring person, but I don't know, there might be more to it.
Okay, thank you. And I saw Ian from Ian and Janet's iPad waving at me. So, Ian, if you might go next.
I thought Boaz was a very honourable man who clearly knew the rules and regulations and the traditions of the time, and the passing down of the laws of land, the land laws. He came over to me as trustworthy, honourable, and just willing to take things a step at a time and see where they went.
Okay. Anyone else wanting to share with me? Linda, if you would go, and then we'll take Lorraine Hawkins next. Oh, Linda, I think you're still on mute by accident. Shall I try? I'll see if I can. Oh, yes. No, I'll see if I can unmute you. I can't do it either. Michael, can you unmute Linda? I can't do it. She can't do it.
I've done it, I think.
Oh, excellent.
I couldn't find the cursor. I could see the thing. Couldn't find the cursor. Yeah, I think Boaz was a kind man, and he was concerned about this young woman, and you know, let her know, glean where she wanted, and feeding her and things. I always get the feeling that he wasn't going to push it any further. But of course, Naomi encouraged Ruth to do that, and he was quite willing to fulfil his obligations. I think he was just a kind man, but he wasn't going to rush in to rescue Naomi in any way. But all came good in the end.
Okay, thank you, Lorraine.
Well, as I understood it, what Boaz said to the nearer relative wasn't quite true, because it was only the brother of a man who died who had to marry the widow. and this man wasn't. So I think there might have been a bit of deceit going on there, unless he didn't really know the law all that well.
Okay, thank you. Navette, you've got your electronic hand waving at me, so we'll take a comment from you next, Navette, please.
Yes, I was about to agree with Lorraine there, but also I was curious why John Goldingay translated Boaz's greeting to Ruth as madam rather than my daughter. In other texts is translated as my daughter, a sort of more I don't know, maybe more familiar term that he receives her.
Say about that right now, or should we just take it?
Sorry, I lost the end of that comment, I think. But if it was a question around why did Goldingay translate it that way, you'll have to ask John himself. If you email him, I'm sure he'd answer.
Okay.
I can't speak for him.
Right.
I think that's interesting, the way, again, you can cast Boaz in very different lights. And I guess one of the points I want to come to just as we end our time together, and I'll say more about in a few minutes, is so Jane is going to share a fair few thoughts on what she thinks of Boaz next week. What I'm trying to get us to do today is to consider where does the narrator want to leave us? What is the narrator trying to provoke in us? So I think the comments around he's an honorable guy are true to the nature of the narrative, in that I think he is presented to us as someone who's trying to do the right thing in the right way, in the right order, honoring the right people. That doesn't mean we can't critique what he does. It doesn't mean we can't critique the culture that he represents. That doesn't mean that we can't be frustrated by it. But I wonder whether, as we approach the narrative, we do want to ask, what are we expected to feel, even if that's not what we actually feel. I do want to pick up on one comment that was made around Naomi and kind of feeling like she's been let down by Yahweh, in that one of the things I found fascinating about the book of Ruth as a whole is that Yahweh is a silent character. Yahweh has doesn't get to present his own agency. So in other Old Testament texts, we have the narrator clearly says, and God said. Whereas in this, we have a couple of people interpreting what Yahweh's done. Yahweh's turned against me. But Yahweh never really says anything, never really does anything. And so I think it's interesting that we receive this text about everyday events in like normal people's lives, and we get their interpretation of it and where God might be. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop us back into breakout rooms just for 5 to 10 minutes, probably 5 or 6, because we're running low on time. And I want you to ask yourselves, what do you think God is thinking, or where do you see God acting in the text or in the story? And if you get to this one as well, what are the possible pastoral benefits or theological significance of the Bible containing a whole book about everyday life experiences in which God's voice and activity are veiled? I'm going to put those questions in the chat, but I'll send you back into breakout rooms now, and we'll have a little conversation about it and then come back.
Hello, everybody. Hello. We're almost all here. We don't know if we've lost a couple of people along the way, but seemingly, but
I think we're all back, aren't we?
Yeah, we're all back. We're all back.
So I know you didn't have that long to process that question. What I want to do is actually leave that hanging for you for the next 4 weeks, because I think as we go through these webinars, as we send out resources, as well as engaging with some of the interests of the passage and different interpretations of the passage, I also want us to engage with the question of what value does this hold for me and for my community, and those I live life with? What is the benefit of this text to me? Because I think ultimately that is the big question that we've got to kind of answer as we engage, because I think that the root of that will lead us into kind of what does God want to say to me through the text. To say a little word on that, as I've been trying to get us to approach the text as a story and kind of read with the grain of the text a little bit, where do I think the narrator's trying to lead us? There are various lines of kind of scholarship that would suggest that what value did this hold for Israel? I'm intrigued by the argument that suggests that actually Ruth existed within the scriptures as a foil for the inherent racism of the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, where all of the foreign women were divorced and thrown out of the nation of Israel. So we may receive it as a discriminatory text because we think that there's quite a lot of inherent sexism in it, whereas actually I think what was the function of it in the life of Israel? I think it was an inherently anti-discriminatory text because it was pro-foreign women in a weird way. Also, what I find interesting is the conversation that was starting to take place around is this a twisting of the law? Has this been twisted deliberately? Has it not been twisted deliberately? Which the magazine on Ruth, the Bible Month magazine on Ruth, does go into on page 13. Interestingly, what we get, if it is a foil for Ezra and Nehemiah, is in Ezra and Nehemiah, the law is being twisted in a way that expels people from the community. And potentially in Ruth, we have the law being twisted in a way that enables people to be invited into the community and benefit from its legal structures. So I find that sort of thing really fascinating. But all that to say, it is an important question for us to ask both, what value does this text have for me, but also what value and function did the text have then? And I just want us to hold that in mind as we go into political readings and young people's readings and feminist readings, that they are important questions to engage with, but let's also allow ourselves to try and read with the grain of where's the narrator trying to lead us? What are we being encouraged to experience through this story, rather than just how do we want to immediately react to it? So I hope that's been useful. I know it's only a little bit of a taster, and I know that we are limited in what we can do in an hour online. I'm just going to invite Jane to kind of close our session, but also set us up, give us a little trailer for next Monday, if you will, Jane, that'd be great.
Okay, so over the next few weeks, we're looking at different aspects. And actually, in our fourth week, on the 22nd, there is a little bit of an opportunity to talk about, well, what do you make of Ruth so far? Which is really interesting. But next week, we're going to be looking at Ruth from a perspective in a post-#MeToo world, a feminist perspective and potentially a womanist perspective. In other words, what it's like to be a person of colour reading it as a feminist text. And so I'm going to give you some homework, everybody, men and women alike, is that just before you come into the meeting space next Monday afternoon, if you would reread the book of Ruth. Michael says it takes 12 minutes to read it aloud, so you probably need to start at about 2:30. It's not like you've got to come miles early. And to reread the book of Ruth, but really read it as if you were imagining that you were a woman. You put your woman's head on, your female's head on, and read the text at that point. And think about it from the perspective of all the women in the space, to think about it from Ruth, but actually you'll notice that there's a group of women in there called the women. You know, there's all sorts of different characters that are women. Try and put your female head on, your women's head on, your feminist head on, whichever kind of head you like, and read it from that perspective, because that's where we're going to be going next week.
That's going to be a lot easier for most of the group than just for the few men.
I'm sure you can manage it. I'm sure you men can get in touch with that side of yourself and read it from that perspective and see what you can see into the insight, because when we're looking at it from that passage, we're looking at it hopefully in a way that informs who we are as people of God in the 21st century. And that it makes no difference whether we're men or women at that moment, but actually to dig under the skin of what it says to women today and what our roles within that are. So that's where we're going next week. That's my flag waving trailer for chivalry or chauvinism, reading Ruth in a #MeToo world.
Great. Shall I call our time to a close then? Is that all right? Shall I pray to finish, and then I'll let you get on with your afternoon stroke evenings.
Thank you.
Thanks, by the way, for everyone, for the way that you've engaged and for being up for reading and for kind of participating, discussing. Sorry that it's slightly limited, but hopefully we'll get better at this as we go through the month, and also hopefully you're still able to get some stuff out of it, even in the midst of the limitations. But let's pray, shall we? Yahweh, I'm grateful that although at times you may feel like you're very veiled from us, like we're not sure where you are and we're not sure what you're up to. And at times we may feel like Naomi and we want to just dwell in the bitterness of our situations. And at times we may feel like Boaz and we've got hard choices to make. And at times we may feel like Ruth and we are overtaken by circumstances going on around us and you know, just caught up in the midst of things. And yet I thank you that you are still present, you are still loving, you are still working. And Yahweh, I'm grateful that we get to receive your scriptures and we are invited to engage with them through our own eyes. Thank you that you have empowered all of us to be able to engage with your word on our own terms. And yet I pray that you help us be humble enough to want to hear other people's perspectives too. We recognize that we are invited into a community of Yahweh followers, and that means leaning on and learning from the experiences of other people and the readings of other people and the wisdoms of other people, as well as being invited to share our own. And Yahweh, I pray that over the coming few weeks, as we try and engage with this text, would you speak to us through it? Would you speak to us through one another? And more than that, would you help us realize the value of this text and this story to us? Not just the value that it had then, but the value it can have now. And would you help us move past our immediate reactions to it and look for the deeper good that is at work in the text? Would you pull out examples for us to follow and things for us to be wary of, and good things to celebrate and negative things to move past? And yeah, would you lead us closer into what it means to be faithful followers of your way, I pray, as we journey through this together. Amen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. It's been really lovely to see you. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and have a free-for-all, or if you just want to do that waving bye-bye thing, or if you want to chat bye-bye, whichever options you'd like to take. But it's been really good to be with you and see you again soon.
So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.